Good afternoon and welcome to Day 4 of the ECS Forum on Justice and Opportunity. My name is Betty Stagg, and as a proud member of the ECS Advocacy Committee, I am pleased to welcome you to today's session on the need for a living wage and how to get it. I joined the Advocacy Committee a few years ago because I wanted to become more active in support of the mission of ECS as it tries to enable its program participants to rise out of poverty and achieve their own goals for economic prosperity. The Advocacy Committee, working with the ECS staff and board, has been identifying issues that we see as societal and systemic barriers that hinder our participants' path to economic independence. 3 of these barriers have been the subject of this week's forum. Yesterday, the benefits cliff. On Monday, the intersection of race and poverty. And today, economic factors, wages, and employment. I hope that you've been able to join us for the first 3 sessions. If not, recordings of all these sessions will be available soon by clicking on your Hoover link or app. Our panelists and speakers this week have offered me many insights. As a person descended from a long line of hardworking people, farmers mostly, I really appreciated what Charles Blow said about his grandparents. He said they woke up working. Poor people work hard. And he also said poverty can be a job in and of itself. So many people are already working 2 or 3 jobs just to survive. So I believe we must make the world of work for everyone for many reasons. Our participants have told us that not only do they want to be able to make a good living and support their families and give back to their communities, and by the way, I think everyone should have something left over for the pursuit of happiness. You know where that comes from. But there are also members, not the least of the reasons is that some of our members want to become employers. They want to own the businesses. So to make the economy work for everyone should not be a controversial issue, and it hasn't always been. It should be universal. But that is not to say that it is not complex, not to say that we don't have work to do and need to understand it. Charmaine Matlock Turner said on Tuesday about many things. We have to educate ourselves. If you don't understand it, you can't change it. That is why I'm so excited to welcome our speakers, our panel here today. 2 people who have dedicated their lives and careers to this world of work, wages, economic mobility, and opportunity. Dr. William E. Spriggs is a nationally known economist and professor, and Ashley Putnam of the Federal Reserve Bank here in Philadelphia. Ashley is the director of the Economic Growth and Mobility Project, a strategic initiative of the Federal Reserve dedicated to promoting equal access to economic opportunity. I know that I will learn so much from them, and I know that you will too. We welcome all the participants, and particularly Dr. Spriggs and Ashley Putnam. Turn it over to you. Thank you, Ashley.
Thank you so much, Betty. And I will echo in just my enthusiasm for being here. This is my 3rd forum of justice and opportunity that I have attended and participated in for Episcopal Community Services, maybe my 4th. And one of the reasons I really love coming here and having these conversations is because I do deeply believe in the work that all of you who are listening here today do. A lot of my work is really thinking about how do we bring research to bear on these critical issues of economic opportunity and poverty, and really thinking about addressing inequality. And what I love about ECS, your members, your team, is that you really do put that mission into practice and think very deeply about the intersection of the research, how to empower and shift narratives for the people you serve, and how to advocate for them in every single part of their lives. And so I just want to say thank you again for the incredible work that ECS continues to do in the Philadelphia region and beyond. So before I do get started, I do get to give my standard Federal Reserve disclaimer, which is my views expressed today are mine alone and do not represent the Federal Reserve Bank of Philadelphia or the Federal Reserve System. And then I want to set a little bit more context for the conversation we're about to have. And I just can't tell you how excited I am to have Professor Spriggs joining us. If you don't know Bill and his work, he is currently the chief economist at the AFL-CIO. He is a professor at Howard University, and he is one of those people who I always look to who is really intentional about shaping conversations around equity, around inclusion, and around how to build better economic ladders for everyone in our economy. So having Bill here and Billy with us, even though virtually, is just such an honor, Bill. We're really excited to have you and looking forward to this conversation. So thanks for being here.
And thank you so much for having me, and thank you for those kind words. And I do appreciate what ECS is doing by lifting up the systemic issues. And it's so important for people who are trying to help alleviate poverty to remember that there are things wrong with the system, and it's not always about fixing people.
That's right. That's right. And I really appreciate that as well. As someone who came from direct service into this work, I think that is something that I take very close to heart. So I'm going to start just really quickly talking about what I do and what leads us at the Fed to being interested in this. I'm sure these are questions that some folks have asked or heard before, but one of the first things I always get is, why does the Federal Reserve care about economic opportunity? Why does the Federal Reserve care about poverty? Why does this matter? And one of the reasons why my initiative was launched 4 years ago was really because we have data and research that demonstrates that building a more inclusive economy is good for everyone. So the conversation we're having today, I want to make sure we know, isn't just about those who are living in lower wage jobs or those who are living in and experiencing poverty or economic insecurity. It is about all of us. It is about building a more inclusive region. It is about building a more sustainable and resilient economy. And it's something we see across the board, that when you put more money into the hands of consumers, it's good for economic growth. And we are coming from a moment that is potentially one of the biggest pilots and case studies we could have on what it means to put more money into the hands of consumers and what that means to stimulate our economy. So I just want to kind of set that as context of, why does the Federal Reserve care about this? We care about it because we know it's good for the economy. But I will say also, we are in a really critical moment for this conversation. We came about in a time where we saw rising economic inequality, and now we are sitting here at the end of 18, 19 months of this downturn, where we are seeing really big disparate impacts, particularly for communities of color, for lower wage workers, for small business owners, for people who were already in really insecure places in our labor market. And so this is kind of the context I wanted to set for us today, is that this conversation, while we know it is good for economic growth, is also at a really critical moment in time where we're going to be making some decisions about what happens to our economy going forward. And of course, we are sitting here today, Bill, in Philadelphia. Philly being, of course, where this project sits, because we are one of the highest poverty large cities in the country. And the minimum wage in the city of Philadelphia is still $7.25 an hour. So I'm wondering, Bill, if you can, just thinking about the pandemic and what's happening in Philly, help us with a little bit of context setting. Why is this conversation we're having about living wages so incredibly important for this moment that we're in?
Well, I think actually, as you were talking about economic stability, and you framed it exactly correctly for people to grasp, this is the fault of schools of business. I'm not blaming economists for this. Schools of business convince their students that the only thing you need to know is microeconomics, and tragically, most students who take micro as undergrads never get to general equilibrium theory. So they get honed in on this idea that profit maximization drives the world, and then you get these rosy outcomes. They don't get to general equilibrium theory, where they get to understand that this is a system. It's not just a bunch of standalone individuals. When you have a market-based economy, and carried out to the extreme in the United States, because we stand out among nations where health is part of the market economy. Housing is part of the market economy.
Right.
Education is part of the market economy. It means that if you don't have equity, you don't have resiliency built into the system.
Mm.
And academic economists have recently gotten very good at documenting the extreme extent of US inequality and giving people an understanding that inequality of the moment in the static sense also means intergenerational inequality, that you don't have the Horatio Alger American dream story of building yourself up by your bootstraps. So we just saw a demonstration of that when, because of the shape of this COVID response that was necessary to contain the spread of the disease, we had to stop economic activity that brought people together. And too many people are making this about, well, low-wage people, blah, 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 blah. This had nothing to do with being low-wage. It happened to do with, in order to contain this virus, you had to stop interpersonal reaction. So businesses that relied on personal services and personal contact happen to be the lowest wage industries in the nation. So we were suddenly put in a position where we were laying off 20 million people, and a way disproportionate share of them, almost 10 million, almost half of them, were food service workers, the lowest paid industry in the United States. And suddenly it was clear to us there is no resiliency in that portion of the economy. These are people literally who drown during normal economic times. They are working poor, an oxymoron. How can you be working and poor? But they were working and poor. And so they were in a position where if we didn't pump huge amounts of money, their already very fragile position literally would have drowned them. And so the extraordinary amount of money it costs to stabilize the economy should be clear evidence to everybody. This is a very expensive proposition that you have so many low-wage workers.
Yep.
And think about it. This is the 21st century. And in this century, we started the century with 5 million more manufacturing workers and 5 million fewer food service workers. But by the time we got to 2020, February of 2020, we had roughly 12.5 million manufacturing workers, and we had 12.5 million food service workers. This is inconceivable. In the 20th century, that would have been the same as saying in 1950 going forward, we're going to chase all the sharecroppers back to sharecropping and get rid of manufacturing workers. That's what we've done in this century. Now, that could have been kind of even trade if food service workers were paid better. There's no intrinsic reason for them to be paid low wages, other than they are service sector workers who do the service that we always look down on. In the United States, this is the work of slaves. It was the work of women in the household, or it was the work of immigrants. And so we've always devalued this work. Again, it has nothing to do with skill, and this tendency to call them not skilled. Many people learn their lesson as they try to prepare food on their own, not having access to restaurants. These are skilled workers because a lot of people found out it's not that easy to make the dishes that they enjoy. And a couple of failures and a whole lot of bad sourdough starter, I hope convinced everybody that these were skilled workers. This could have been, and we shouldn't rule out this may not repeat itself, this could have been a computer virus. This could have been a computer virus that infected our financial system, forced us to shut down the work of people who work with computers. And then would we be saying, oh, well, these are low-skilled workers because they got shut down? I mean, this is just the peculiar nature of this virus, but it taught us a lesson that having 20 million low-wage workers is expensive to the economy.
Yeah, I really appreciate that framing, Bill, and something we talk a lot about at the Fed, where especially in our team, we do a lot of research on skill. And one of the things we're learning is that a lot of workers in low-wage jobs have some of the most in-demand skills in our economy. And anybody who's listening today has ever worked in, like myself, the service industry, this is not easy work, right? And we're talking about this with childcare, which is also a really low wage industry. And all of a sudden our childcare centers were shut down, and everyone is providing 24/7 care and realizing, oh my goodness, we have really undervalued this work and the critical importance it plays in our economy. So I really love this framing that low wage does not mean low skill. And in fact, we have extraordinarily skilled workers who are occupying low wage jobs. And as well as I think that the conversation about the cost of the economy. I saw a statistic recently about the percentage of people who are homeless and are working. And so what does that mean? That we are paying in some way for them to not be able to have economic stability and not be able to have economic opportunity. I'm wondering, Bill, if you can reflect on, you mentioned some things about kind of our history and narratives around this work, right? Now we're calling them essential. We got this year of like, we went from them being, low wage and low skilled to being essential workers. And now we're kind of quickly shifting back into like, those are low skilled jobs, they should just get back to work. But there is something really powerful about what you said about who has historically done these jobs. And it occurs to me, and I've read some things you've written, that, these are not accidental policies, right? There is a history of policies that have gotten us to this place around wages. And so I'm wondering if you can reflect for folks who aren't familiar here about some of the historical perspective in terms of wages and tiered wages, and who we decided was worthy of which wages.
Right. So a great lesson, economic lesson for economists was the Great Depression, the 1930s. Economists to that point believed that markets cleared because if demand fell, prices would fall, and you'd reach a new equilibrium, and everything would then recalibrate. What we found out was that's not true. And we began to challenge these notions that the market gave the right answer. And so what many people began to believe was that the market left alone would drive wages down to some intolerable level that wouldn't sustain the economy. And we agreed that we would have minimum wages. But at the same time, we were having a deep discussion about who's going to be protected by this New Deal. And the initial efforts at stabilizing the economy and stabilizing wages, the National Recovery Act, Southern Democrats instantly seized upon, we don't want this opportunity to change our racial balance. And they attempted to have encoded into the federal standards racial wage differences, which fortunately they lost that argument. Then they argued, well, we should have regional wage differences because people in the South eat corn pone and molasses, and we don't really need much to survive on. And as long as we have our fat back in molasses, we're okay. And there was an attempt to try and do these regional wage differences. Immediately, the Black civil rights community seized upon how ironic that steel workers near Pittsburgh got high wages. And as you move south, West Virginia, and then down to Alabama and Bessemer, Alabama, suddenly those wages got lower and lower and lower.
Yeah.
As the workers got blacker and blacker and blacker. And so when the NRA and the attempt to manage wages and the wage recovery stalled, Southerners were then confronted with these universal concepts, the right to organize and minimum wages. And they seized upon, we need to exclude certain workers because that would threaten the racial hierarchy of the South. So the compromise was to eliminate those occupations which were at the heart of white supremacy in the South: agricultural workers, domestic workers had to be excluded. Now, a lot of people say, well, they were excluded from the Social Security Act and the right to organize because well, administratively, this would be very difficult to do because they're farm workers. Or this had nothing to do with that. I mean, at the time, it was unusual for sort of formal payrolls because there was no income tax. There was no reason for employers to have formal structures like we now accept as normal. This had everything to do with the power relationship, why certain groups would be excluded. Now, the exclusion of these occupations meant 75% of Black people didn't get minimum wage protection, didn't get the protection of the right to organize, did not get Social Security. But it's important to remember a lot of white people were cannon fodder to that attitude because it also eliminated most of the jobs that women did, those women who were in the marketplace, and a great swath of Southern whites. So when you ask, well, what's the legacy of that? That couldn't matter. But the white people were excluded. That is Appalachia. Mm-hmm. So when you understand why is Appalachia permanently poor, why are Black people permanently poor, it's the exact same reason. If you take a whole group of occupations and exclude them from the basis of what we consider to be fair play, the idea of wage norms and decency, it has long-lasting implications. That's why it's very hard to solve poverty in Appalachia. That's why it's very hard to solve poverty among African Americans, because you wrote out this huge group of people who did not benefit as others did. We had wonderful research from Laura Derenoncourt, who's now at Princeton, documenting that when Adam Clayton Powell got to be chair of Education and Labor in the House of Representatives in the early 1960s, when we updated the minimum wage laws and closed the gap in coverage so that many more workers suddenly became protected by the minimum wage laws, we closed the Black-white wage gap by 20%. Just saying we will ensure by law that Black people in most of these occupations will be paid fairly. The other legacy that was left over, unfortunately, from the compromise in 1960 to expand coverage was to give in on a set of workers who lived by tips. And that legacy goes directly back to Reconstruction, when Southerners refused this idea that Blacks would be paid wages and treated on equal footing with white workers as regular workers. Instead, many of the occupations, the service occupations in which Blacks work, the workers only receive tips. That is, I force you to subjugate yourself, to grovel, to understand the power relationship between me and you, that I will only pay you on the basis of what I think you deserve, on the basis of what you do for me. So many people go, well, Adam Clayton Powell didn't do that good because he left these people out, but understand he got a 20% closing of the wage gap for Blacks, which you cannot do through education. I mean, for everybody who says, well, why don't you just, educate Blacks more? This has nothing to do, the Black-white wage gap has too little to do with education. So he gave up this. He gave up tip workers. And just as a reminder, many people romanticize the Pullman porters on the trains because they had middle-class status for Black people. And oddly, within the railroad industry, almost all of the Blacks who had college degrees were Pullman porters. Mm. But Pullman porters were tipped workers. The reason they formed a union was they wanted more regular hours. Their hours were horrible. And they wanted rest breaks and some other things, but they also wanted wages, not to depend solely on tips. And this inequality that's baked into the system because we've excluded tip workers now again haunts women, deeply haunts women, because in the food service industry, many of those workers are tipped workers. And we understand the relationship between sexual harassment at work, sexual harassment from the owners, sexual harassment from the customers, that workers have to endure because the relationship of a tipped worker is, you are beneath me, you must meet my pleasure in order for me to pay you. And, we don't like to think of ourselves as evil or whatever, but check your psychology, check your attitude when you have someone who is serving you, and think through your attitude when you say, I'm not going to tip them because look at how they serve me. And then flip it. How many of you would say, I don't want a salary. I'm going to go to my boss and just say, I'm a hard worker. You just pay me what you think I deserve for what I did today. I don't think I'm going to see any hands going up saying, oh, that's how I want to get paid. I want to get paid based on what my employer thinks of me that day. I don't think anybody's raising their hand.
Yeah. Oh, and it's such a great perspective, Bill, to think about, like, would we want that? I've heard many colleagues, especially right now when we're having this moment with the service industry, having a hard time finding workers, say, is it the service industry or the servant industry, right? Like how we treat people, but also like often in these conversations economically that we've just kind of decided this is what they deserve. And keeping in mind as we're having this conversation that tipped minimum for the service industry is still, I believe, $2.13 or 15 cents, which I would just like to say for context is what I made when I was in high school and I worked in the service industry. And that has not changed. So there's just a really, like, as we're having a conversation about poverty and economic security and economic recovery, and you're thinking about people who are making $2.15 plus tips, or, even with that $7.25 an hour, that really says something about like what we decide is that the worth of that job. And it is something I think you're making some powerful points also about how this has changed. We did a series earlier this year with some of the most profound conversations I've had in this recovery, specifically about the unique impacts on women and particularly women of color of this pandemic, but also just when we start to talk about recovery and we want to build a more inclusive recovery, how do we do that and not talk about wages? And so I'm wondering if you could dig a little deeper also, because I know I hear a lot about like domestic work and where immigrant women particularly are in our workforce. And I know these are also a lot of folks that folks at ECS are working on behalf of and serving, about kind of that gender and racial disparity that's caused by this.
Yeah, and it gets back to a point you were just making. We went through an unusual time in our history when we decided we would blame the poor. And we concocted a weird theology of the deserving poor.
Yeah.
That only some people are deserving of our aid, others are lazy, and we must teach them a lesson. Unfortunately, we've gone from the deserving poor to saying that about workers.
Yeah. Yeah.
So often you will hear people say, well, daycare workers should be paid more if they had more training. Well, if they wanted higher wages, they should have more education.
Yeah.
And this notion that now I'm blaming workers, not poor people who aren't working, I'm blaming workers for their own poverty.
Mm-hmm.
You just have to scratch your head. Like, how did we go from deserving poor to now we have deserving workers? Some workers aren't deserving because you don't have enough education. So therefore you don't deserve. And understand where someone is who's getting $7.25 an hour, because I testified about raising the minimum wage with one of those workers who's leading the fight for 15. And he described the two jobs he works and the job that his wife works. They both can't work two jobs because they had children. Somebody had to have some time at some point to tend the children. So there are 3 jobs among these 2 people. They're below poverty. And what I pointed out is, you understand, you have created a system in which someone is working and they hope to get to be poor. They hope. Their dream is, please let me get to the poverty level. That's a sick society.
Yeah.
That's a sick society. And when you think about our macroeconomic policy tools, the Federal Reserve can control the temperature of the economy, I'm sorry, I'm mixing metaphors. It can control the water level of the economy. And so it can get the economy to full employment. There are very few tools that the Fed has that effectively sets the wage rate. Mm-hmm. And when you think about what many people do to try and alleviate poverty, a lot of their work is focused on, how can I get people to work? How can I either get them training so they can get a job with regular hours, or how can I connect them to a job? Most of what we do is built around get someone a job.
Yeah. Yeah.
For most of the history of the minimum wage, the public policy was, if you had that wage, it would be a poverty level wage. That is, at least I would be poor. So I would start in poverty, and then I could work my way up from poverty. I could aspire to the middle class. Not I would aspire to poverty.
Yeah.
But we don't have the tools to set wages and employment. That's beyond what the Fed can do. That's beyond what even macroeconomic policy can do on the fiscal side alone. So we have to have a fundamental that if you work, we've solved the poverty problem.
Yeah.
All we have to do is figure out, how can we get people a job? If you're asking me, how do I solve poverty? If I'm going to accept that people can work and be poor, then you can never solve poverty. You should shut up, because you don't want to solve poverty. You have no interest in solving poverty. You're saying, I agree some people will be poor. That's the calculus I'm willing to live with, and so be it. That is what you were saying.
Yeah. Oh, and it's
you simply cannot say, I'm for solving poverty. I hate poverty. I want poverty to be alleviated, but you can work and be poor. You can't say that.
Yeah. And it's such a powerful comment, Bill. I'll share. And I think I've talked about this before at ECS Forums, but I got into this work in direct service coming right out of the last economic downturn. So in 2009, and I was sitting with job seekers who were coming from, jobs that were higher paying jobs in an economy where the majority of the job growth was in low wage, very irregular hour service jobs. And now I'm telling a woman who has 3 children that you should take this job at 20 hours a week at $7.25 an hour until you find something better. And that is often our theory here. But what I realized as I was doing this work that I felt so passionately was about alleviating poverty was that we weren't doing any such thing. And in fact, many of the people we served bounced from low wage job to another insecure job, and never even got to a place where they were economically secure enough to know whether or not they were going to have money to pay rent at the end of that month. And we used to do these financial planning forums that was required of us, because one of the theories was, well, people aren't good at planning financially. So I would sit down with people and I would say, all right, let's start your financial plan. All right, you got $7.25 an hour, 30 hours a week. All right, you got $1,100. Oh, how much is your rent? It's New York City. It's $1,000. All right, so now you have $100 to take care of your children, to put food on the table. We don't need to do a financial plan. There's nothing for you to financially plan. And we are in a really unique moment where, we actually saw one of the big benefits of this downturn was some economic policy that provided people a little more of a safety net. And it is possible that during that safety net, some people in the service industry said, I don't think I want to do this anymore. I want to be in something more stable. So I really appreciate that perspective, that if we are here collectively having this conversation about really trying to do work to change the narrative on poverty, to actually change poverty, we have to talk about wages. And I want to switch a little here, Bill, to say, there are some assumptions that are made. And as an economist, I know you'll know, so maybe you can take it from the econ level. But there are some assumptions we make here in this conversation that there are some either ors, right? That like, well, if we raise wages, it'll be bad for businesses. And honestly, like some of those assumptions aren't even data-based. And so I'm wondering if you could talk to us a little bit about how did this story become the prominent story that we tell about wages? And what does the data actually say about raising wages?
Yeah, so it's very fascinating. Again, the deep lesson from the Great Depression. We changed the economic consensus and the political consensus. People understood that part of the problem was there wasn't enough demand in the system. We had gone through the early part of the 20th century, from 1900 to 1920, massive increase in productivity. And, Henry Ford and the assembly line, everybody knew that and feared that this automation was destroying jobs. It would destroy jobs if you didn't get paid. And that's what they understood. And so the political and economic consensus was we must have enough demand coming out of workers for goods and services. All the way through the 1960s, Democrats and Republicans voted to raise the minimum wage. The two biggest increases in the minimum wage were overwhelmingly passed by Republicans in the House of Representatives, overwhelmingly, like 90%. That increase in the 1960s, which expanded coverage and was one of the bigger increases in the minimum wage, passed with overwhelming Republican support. This was not an issue. Americans deeply believe work is supposed to pay. If you have a job, you're not supposed to be poor. That was the consensus. Since then, and again, this is the poor education of a lot of people because of economists. A lot of economists started using the textbooks. The government is bad, and their example was the minimum wage. You raise the minimum wage in a supposedly fair market, and it would be above what most firms would be willing to pay. A lot of workers would want to work at that wage, but employers wouldn't want to hire them. Now, I'm going to take one giant step back to get back to how preposterous working poverty is. In order to get the supply of labor, all economists are taught this. Workers have a choice between leisure and work, and they maximize their utility by balancing their value of leisure versus the value of work. They are freely entering this contract because they think they're getting more from work than their value of leisure. No one would freely enter a contract to work and be poor. That's not possible. No one says, my value of leisure is I'd rather be poor. No, if you're going to be poor, then I'd rather not work. Yeah. So once you recognize, well, this is being violated, because why are people, quote unquote, voluntarily agreeing that they can't pay their bills, can't buy food, can't have shelter over their head? Why would you voluntarily do that? Once you understand that, then you go, well, this notion that this is free contract supply demand, but that can't be true. It must be true that employers have some power over workers such that workers would agree that I will take this job even though I know at the end of the day, if I keep this up, I'm going to die because I'm not going to have food, or I'm not going to have shelter, or something will be lacking. And so once you understand that, then you know that this lesson that we built into people's heads, that increased wages destroys jobs, that can't be true. Mm-hmm. Economists have studied this inside out, backside, forward. We've had states raise minimum wages, cities raise minimum wages. We've had what we consider to be natural experiments. That is, we can see some places where the wage went up, other places it didn't go up. Famous study by David Card, who won the Nobel Prize for understanding, oh, that's like an experiment. We treated New Jersey that raised its minimum wage. Pennsylvania was untreated. It didn't raise its minimum wage. Ironically, we're talking about New Jersey and Pennsylvania now. And we can study. There are counties that border New Jersey and Pennsylvania. We can look at the counties and the businesses in New Jersey that had higher wages and the counties that border them in Pennsylvania that did not, and see what happened to employment. And sure enough, this was one of his first natural experiments, shows up, boom, nothing happened to employment. Nothing happened. Employment in New Jersey did not change differently than in Pennsylvania.
Yeah, I was gonna say, didn't employment actually improve a little bit in New Jersey?
It actually went up in New Jersey. It actually went up. And actually, this is part of economic theory because economists have this thing called monopsony, which is the opposite of monopoly. So a monopsonist is someone who buys as sort of the sole buyer of something as opposed to the sole seller. And so for a monopsony, if you raise the price, then they actually buy more of the good and are more profitable. This is the key. They are pushed to a more profitable point. So actually, if you believe in the explanation for why these wages are off is because of monopsony power, then you would think that, yes, wages are going to go up a little bit and the firms will be more productive. But we have had this shoved down our throats, and this is the power of money to capture the debate, to shape the debate, to get on the table when you don't deserve to be on the table, because on the basis of the facts, they're not on your side. But because I paid for the table, I get to have my say, and I get to have people discuss what I want to discuss, even if it's inane. And in this case, this is just inane. We've studied it as much as it can possibly be studied. For one policy, there are more papers on the minimum wage and what does it do than any other policy we have. And again, because there's ample evidence and ample opportunity to study it in many dimensions. And yet it holds sway that we have to discuss it anyway. The other irony is, in all other policy debates, when we understand that something might be good for the economy, then economists retreat to our Schumpeterian view that competition is good. The fit beat the unfit. There are survivors. And there's a reality to this as well. Maybe there are some firms that can't make it, but there are firms that therefore benefit because they reach this better profitability point. They will absorb the firms that shrink. This is why we tell people well, trade is good, because the market will weed out the weak, reward the strong. We don't discuss that with the minimum wage. And again, that's the capture. That's the capture to say that the net effect is good, but we don't worry about the net effect. We have to worry about, the micro effect. It's like, well, we didn't do that on trade. So where did you suddenly come from?
Yeah, like why do we worry about the micro effect for that one worker, right? No, this is, I think, a very powerful, it is a very powerful story that we tell. And it's sometimes one of the challenges, I think, for a lot of folks who are listening today that we find is how do we debunk that story? And you mentioned some great research, Laura Derricourt and her research on what happened to Black-white income inequality when wages were shifted. David Card got the Nobel Prize this year, if that is correct, for this research on the disparity between New Jersey and Pennsylvania when they increased wages, that they didn't lose jobs. And there's all sorts of studies out there that have shown that story that we're telling is not necessarily true in actual lived practice beyond economic theory. But it is a really pervasive and powerful story. And it is, as we're kind of turning over to questions, one of the first questions I'm seeing here is that story about the job loss and minimum wage increases. So I'm curious if you can also help us talk about, like, how do people have this conversation? How do you, when you're, for folks who are talking about advocacy and talking about how they advocate on behalf of their clients, you may be talking to people who are really leading with that story of, but we'll lose jobs. And so how do folks here start to really think about having those conversations, both in their advocacy efforts and with others who are maybe not as familiar with the numerous studies that we know from the economic side of the world?
Yeah, it's hard because again, this capture has captured the media and the imagination of so many people. And like I said, so many people have been miseducated. And so this is the fault of us econ professors to even have that should not be in the textbook. And like I started with, the textbook only makes sense if workers are freely negotiating. And like I said, from a common sense perspective, you should understand no one freely enters an agreement that makes them worse off. That cannot be out of free will. That's out of something else, which tells me that there's the power to coerce something to get an outcome. Mm. The reality is, try and explain it as the theory says. This theory that the minimum wage is bad is based on there is a market clearing wage. Now, I did research alongside Card and Kruger at the same time they were doing their work. And when I had these research assistants call to find wages in restaurants in Mississippi, we chose, let's go to a low wage state, not high wage states.
Yeah.
It was clear there is no such thing as a market clearing wage. Some restaurants paid this wage, another restaurant paid that wage. The wages for what, by theory is a pretty common job, many people could do this, isn't this the same industry? The wages were not the same. So there is no market clearing wage. And that theory works only, and only the narrow industry in which there really is a wage declared by the market, and it allows firms to hire as many workers as they wish at that given wage. And again, common sense shows you that isn't what's out there. The wages aren't the same. In the same market in Jackson, Mississippi, there was no such thing as the wage. In fact, for some of these restaurants, there wasn't even the wage. And there was some confusion about when you said, how many workers do you have? There's so much turnover. Then it was like, well, do you mean how many workers do we have Tuesday? Or how many workers we had on Friday? Because it's not the same number of people. Yeah. And therefore, it's not the same wage.
Right.
And so what people have to understand is that's a very narrow, exceedingly narrow, and very unlikely occurrence that there is such a thing. And what economists or labor economists have now switched to is the belief that no, there's a lot of monopsony power. That is, there's a lot of power among employers to set and determine wages on their own, that they aren't really responding to. There is a market wage. And so hopefully people will begin to understand, hopefully there are no kids watching, there's no tooth fairy. Economists who told you that story, this was just meant as a fairy tale. It was just and this was hyperbole, to explain how a market would work and how a government intervention might play out. But it had no basis in fact. It has no basis in fact. It's a very bad example to give people because it is such an unlikely occurrence that it's meaningless. It's a meaningless. It's meaningless. Yeah. And so I think people have to remind people, again, we have raised the minimum wage in many different places, and we've not seen the job loss. Did it in Seattle, did it in Oakland, did it in Minneapolis.
Yeah. And there's actually a flip side of that theory, Bill, that we've been hearing. In some ways, it can actually be a job driver, right? People will move to that place and it can actually have net positive impacts because now you have low wage people who were just barely scraping by and paying bills who are now becoming consumers in maybe supporting the small businesses. So that's the other side of the cycle that we always say, we don't tell the story, but if you look at how our economy has survived this moment, when people were able to get stimulus and the added UI, we know that putting cash into the hands of consumers does in fact stimulate the economy, right? We proved that through a massive natural experiment to some extent of what just happened in our country. And yet when we talk about wages, we feel very uncomfortable about that conversation. So I really do think, I will ask one of the other questions that's in here, which is something we hear, is this something that, like, if we raise wages, that disproportionately impacts small businesses? And I've heard of people talking about a tiered wage between, small businesses and large corporations. And so how do you answer that concern? Because we are in a critical moment where small businesses are also really struggling, particularly BIPOC-owned small businesses, and how they're going to survive this downturn.
Well, what many small businesses do is they understand the general equilibrium effects that they weren't taught and that aren't reemphasized in schools of business.
Yeah.
And one restaurant owner put it this way: I have 10 employees. If I pay those 10 employees more, that costs me this much. I have 10,000 customers. If those 10,000 customers get paid this much, that's a lot more money. Which do I concern myself with? The 10 people I have to pay more money to, or the 10,000 people who are going to pay me more money? And that calculus is pretty straightforward. I want my customers to have more money.
Yeah.
And so it's thinking through the whole equation. And there are many restaurant owners who have done that, despite what the Restaurant Owners Association wants to always push. There are many thoughtful restaurant owners who understand this cuts down on my turnover. When I pay higher wages, like what I was talking about in Jackson, Mississippi, they didn't know how many employees they had in any given week because the turnover was so high. I pay higher wages, I have less turnover. And as many of these firms are finding out right now, recruiting workers costs money. It's not like, oh, I just get another employee. That doesn't happen. And if you get another employee, as many restaurants are finding out now, because as much as people are talking about, the age of the quit and the quit rates are high, the quit rates are only high in leisure and hospitality and in warehousing. And all the other industries, the quit rates are pretty close to what they were last year. It's in these specific industries where many employers still haven't got the message and are trying to hold on to a model that isn't sustainable, but they found out it's not that easy to recruit people. And so reducing turnover reduces cost.
Absolutely.
And that's the other thing that these studies of the minimum wage documented. That was my contribution to the whole thing. Was it lowered turnover, which was a dramatic thing. It really does reduce turnover. And the other thing to remember is when you raise the minimum wage, as you were pointing to, the total general equilibrium effects, it pushes employers to have workers do more productive things. There was a restaurant in Seattle where, because of COVID, they had to cut down on in-house service, but they were nationally known and they were able to take advantage of people wanting their product, but they had to get it to them. They had to improve their website. They had to improve fulfillment of the orders. So they took a person that they had been paying a lower wage, understood that actually this person has an associate's degree and could do a web page. and they went from a lower wage job to a much higher wage job, producing much more value for the company because now they opened up a whole product market for the company that they didn't have.
Yeah.
And so when you change the wage, you cut down on the competition that firms face from that lower wage competition. Mm-hmm. Everybody now has to figure out how to compete on a higher plane. And so an individual restaurant may say, well, how would I do this? Because I don't see how on my own in my competitive landscape, I can change wages, but they're forgetting, no, we're changing wages for everybody. So you do not get there is no competitive disadvantage because everybody you're competing with is paying a higher wage. So this notion, again, it's just my firm. This economists call it partial equilibrium. Looking at just that part of the equilibrium misses the bigger picture, the full equilibrium, the general equilibrium question.
Yeah. No, and I was going to say, Bill, I think this is such a great, we're in such a great moment in time to illustrate this, right? Because one of the unique things that's happened in this pandemic is your question about, do I choose leisure or work? That was never really a choice anyone had, right? We don't get to live lives of leisure and just chill out at home. there's no stability. People are barely scraping by. And in the small thing we have seen in this moment in time is that the tiny amount of additional safety net we gave people agency that they haven't had before. And he's flipping a little bit of this power dynamic. And that's in some ways, businesses are adjusting so that they can continue to keep and retain workers. So I want to close with one final question, because I know we have to go to Betty and wrap up. But you talked a lot about history, what got us here. I mean, these are big systemic issues, right? And these are real challenges for the folks that ECS is serving. So I'm wondering if you could end telling us, what suggestion do you have for forum participants for what they should do in terms of an action item for raising the living wage?
So I think it is important. We've talked about this bad theory that's been pushed on everybody. It is really important for people to train themselves and update themselves and get over this miseducation, because I think that will make them stronger advocates. I think people have to reintroduce a belief and a confidence in their faith. And you have to ask yourself, if something is unjust, how could it be right? And you have to renew your sense of faith. If my faith tells me what's just and what's unjust, how could something that's unjust, how could the absence of justice be the right answer? And it's just like what I was talking about with, can I voluntarily enter into agreement that impoverishes me? The answer is no. If I come across an answer I know is not just, my antennas go up immediately, because I'm like, that can't be the right answer. If you're telling me injustice is the right answer, my antenna are through the roof. Like, no. That cannot be the right answer. And sure enough, in my experience, every time I've investigated when somebody's tried to convince me that injustice is the correct answer, they're wrong.
Yeah. And I think that's just such a great note to end on. You illustrated really well that way. You asked the question of, like, would you want that? Would you want that for yourself, for your child, for someone you care about, to be in a place where they're having to make a decision that is essentially a choice to choose to live in poverty and economic insecurity? And I think sometimes when we think about it as sort of impacting those people over there, we don't think about that those people are someone's, mother, father, sister, brother, self, right? And those are never decisions we would want for ourselves or our loved ones. So why are they decisions that we accept in our system? So I just think that's a great place for us to end. And I don't know, Bill, if you have any other closing remarks, but I am just so grateful for this conversation, so energized by this. I hope for the ECS folks listening who are involved in your advocacy efforts and involved in the work that you do, that you'll just sit with knowing how incredibly important this is, particularly at this moment in time.
Well, thank you so much, and thank you for having me. And I do celebrate that ECS is thinking about this system. Dr. King, when he gave his sermon on the road to Jericho, pointed this out, that there are things that are systemically wrong. When you think about the sermon about the road to Jericho was the Good Samaritan. And so many people think of that as the service provider. This is the ultimate service provider, right? I'm compassionate. I see this person who's been hurt and injured, and I respond. But in his sermon, Dr. King said, who agreed that this dangerous winding road that this traveler had to go on should be not guarded? Why are you, and remember, right, rich people would have servants with them, they're not going to get robbed. But those who needed to make it to temple, who are single women, who have to go down that treacherous road, or just a regular worker like the one in the story of the Good Samaritan, they don't have guards. And they make this dangerous road where it was easy for robbers to hide. Who said that's the right system? Yeah. And his challenge to us in his version of the Good Samaritan story in the road to Jericho was someone has to ask the question, who agreed that this man gets to be robbed?
Powerful. Oh, that's wonderful. Thank you, Bill. I know we have to turn it back over to Betty, but I'm just so grateful for this conversation and so inspired and challenged to go out and continue to do this work. And wanted just to say thanks for taking the time and having this conversation. I hope we can continue to do this work, particularly in the state of Pennsylvania, in the city of Philadelphia, and on behalf of the folks that we are all working towards creating a more inclusive economy and a more resilient economy. And so I just thank you so much for your time and expertise and sharing your knowledge and words of wisdom today.
Thank you.
And thanks to both Ashley and Dr. William Spriggs for this powerful, informative, and very inspiring conversation. I know this has given me a lot to think about, and I know it's given our participants an opportunity to better understand the kind of technical economic issues, which are complicated maybe, but the real bottom line issue, which is what I'm so appreciative that Dr. Spriggs summed up at the end of his comments. Thank you again. And I want to just bring us to mention that this afternoon at 4:00, the next session in this forum will be about faith-based advocacy. It will be about how we as faith-based people might discover more about our own power as individuals, as congregations, to raise awareness on key issues, to generate scale and momentum, and try to make real change in our communities. So that will be led by the Reverend Jared Kerbel, who is rector of the Episcopal Church of St. Martin in the Fields, and he will be joined by Bishop Dwayne Royster, Francis Upshaw, and Martin Trimble. I hope that all of you can come to that. And again, there is another opportunity for people to promote the passage of a minimum wage in the state of Pennsylvania. And if you go to the Hoover app and access ECS Advocacy Action Booth, there's a link there that you can write right to your Pennsylvania senator and ask him to pass Senate Bill 12. We will have other calls to action as part of this conference. There has been so much that we have learned and more that we will. The closing session is at noon tomorrow, but our special session on faith-based advocacy will be a perfect sequel to the closing of this session. And again, thank you to Ashley and thank you, Dr. Spriggs.